I'm writing this late at night, sitting in a chair that creaks like it knows all the wrong things I've done. I've never signed my name to anything like this. I can't. Not anymore. There's one truth I've carried longer than I should have, and it gnaws at me because I learned it too late. Too late to make it right. I was 19, the first time I realized that following orders could be worse than doing nothing at all. It was early March, 1945. Cold. Gray. The kind of cold that seeps through the soles of your boots and refuses to leave. We were in the Ardennes, or what was left of it after the snow melted into mud. Our unit was mostly stragglers, boys patched together from shattered companies, half of them coughing up winter. I remember the smell first. Wet wool, smoke, and something faintly metallic that I didn't want to name. That's when I started carrying the watch with me. My father's, heavy and dented from years of his own work on the railroad. It kept me grounded, I told myself, counting minutes when the world seemed to have lost all measure. I was never alone there. At least, not completely. Mike Callahan was my shadow, my nearest thing to a brother. Blonde, quick to laugh, even when it didn't make sense. He had a way of pulling your mind off the mud and the guns for just a second. And in that moment, you could almost feel human. We shared cigarettes from the same tin, half smoked and crushed in our palms, swapping stories that were only funny because we were too young to understand the danger. Orders came down one evening from Lieutenant Harper, a man who had the kind of authority that made you forget your own gut. We were told to sweep a farmstead at the edge of the woods, to clear any stragglers and report back. Harper didn't say civilians or enemy, just stragglers. I trusted him, and I trusted my training. That's how it always starts, isn't it? The assumption that someone else's authority means what they're asking is right. We moved through the forest, snow crunching underfoot, rifles loose at our sides. Mike kept nudging me with his elbow, making a face as if to say, "Can you believe this?" But I was quiet. I'd found the watch under my coat and turned it over in my hands again. Its cold metal pressing against my palm like a heartbeat I could control. There was a farmhouse ahead, dark and shuttered, smoke curling faintly from the chimney. Someone lived there, but we had been told there were no civilians, only stragglers. I didn't question it, not out loud. Mike glanced at me, a flicker of unease in his eyes, and I remember thinking I should say something. Maybe I could have. Maybe that hesitation could have changed everything. But I didn't. I followed the order. There's a detail I've never told anyone, not even my wife. Something I saw in the yard before we entered. I can't write it clearly yet, because it feels like naming it makes it true. But it stayed with me, hovering behind every decision I've made since. A choice I made that night, small and almost invisible, has been gnawing at me ever since. I didn't understand what that choice would cost until weeks later. By the time we returned to the line, the sky had darkened to a bruised gray. Mike didn't speak much, and I didn't either. Something had shifted between us, a silence loaded with the weight of the unspoken. That night, I rolled the watch under my pillow, feeling the dented edge bite lightly into my wrist, and wondered if the world would ever let me forget. Would you have done differently? I don't know. Even now, I don't. And that's the part that scares me the most. The next morning, the snow had turned gray and sticky, clinging to our boots as we moved back toward the remnants of the unit. The farmhouse still lingered in my mind. The way the windows caught the dim light, the smell of smoke and something else, faint but unmistakable, that made me stiffen in the chest. Mike didn't mention it, and I didn't either. We had that quiet understanding. Some things weren't spoken, or they'd be too heavy to bear. Lieutenant Harper was waiting when we returned, pacing in the mud, outside the command post. He didn't look angry. He rarely did. But there was a tension in the set of his shoulders, and the way he glanced at us like we were pieces on a board had been forced to move. "Report," he said. His voice was flat, neutral, but I could feel it slice through the cold morning air. I spoke first, because I always did. I told him the house was empty, just as the order had said, and that no one resisted. Mike's eyes flicked to mine, that same quiet flicker of warning, but he nodded at the end. We were supposed to be a single voice, unbroken. Later, when the unit scattered for breakfast, or whatever counted as it in this mess, I found a corner alone. The watch was heavy in my pocket, my thumb tracing the cracked crystal. I tried to convince myself that I'd done nothing wrong, that the order was clear, and that following it didn't make me guilty. But there was something lodged in my chest, a quiet hesitation that didn't let go. Mike came up behind me, his face pale under the gray light. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked, low, almost a whisper. I froze, heart kicking. I didn't want to answer because saying yes felt like sealing a truth I wasn't ready to carry. But his eyes, blue, bright, full of the kind of honesty I had always trusted, made it impossible to lie. I nodded barely. "What are we supposed to do?" he said. That was the question, wasn't it? There was no manual for this. No answer in the training that told you what to do when orders collide with conscience. I shrugged, and we walked in silence, letting the mud suck at our boots. That afternoon, Harper called us both aside. "You two with me," he said, gesturing toward the ridge. "Recon, there's a report of movement near the woods. Quick check. No heroics. But there's never a no heroics in war, is there?" I knew that, and so did Mike. As we climbed the ridge, my mind kept returning to the farmhouse, to the faint outline in the yard that morning. That image was a seed, and I knew it would grow into something I couldn't ignore. My hand brushed the watch under my coat, feeling its dented edges like a lifeline. It had become more than a watch. It was a reminder, a witness, and a question. Could I survive this war and still call myself a good man? We crested the ridge, and Harper was already scanning the horizon. I noticed something that made my stomach twist. The same shadow I'd glimpsed in the farmhouse, though it was harder to read at a distance. I didn't speak. Mike didn't either. We moved closer, rifles ready, hearts thudding against our ribs. I still didn't know what I would do. That detail I hadn't spoken of, what I had chosen not to act upon, was waiting, and I could feel it waiting for me here. In the cold, in the mud, in the gray March light. The choice wasn't behind me. It was right in front of me, and I was about to make it again. The ridge was silent, except for the wind rattling through the bare branches. I kept my hand on the watch under my coat, the metal pressing against my palm like a heartbeat I could control, but never quite calm. Mike moved beside me, quieter than usual, his eyes scanning every shadow, every shift in the snow. I could feel his tension pressing against mine, and I wondered if he knew, the way I did, that the farmhouse hadn't been empty. We spotted the movement first as a flicker near the tree line, too deliberate to be wind or wildlife. Harper raised his binoculars, scanning, his face unreadable. "Stay low," he said. His voice was measured, but the authority in it carried the weight of finality. I had no doubt he expected compliance, unquestioning. That had always been the rule. That had always been the law we obeyed without asking whether it was right. As we crept closer, the shape resolved into a figure crouched by a pile of firewood, small, thin, and unmistakably human. A boy, maybe 14 or 15, though his face was hidden beneath a threadbare cap. He looked up briefly, eyes wide and scared, before ducking again. My stomach went tight. I knew, without speaking, that this was the detail I'd glimpsed at the farmhouse. The truth I had tried to push aside had followed me here, ghost-like, demanding recognition. Harper's whisper cut through my thoughts. "Woo, take him. No questions." I swallowed. The words made my throat tight. Take him? What did that even mean? A prisoner? A straggler? Or something else entirely? I glanced at Mike. His jaw was tight, fists clenched at his sides. He was waiting for me to do something, or maybe to be silent. I had no answer. The choice that had haunted me weeks before now stood in front of me, flesh and fear and eyes that trusted no one. We moved in a semicircle, Harper leading. My boots sank into the mud, and I kept my gaze on the boy. I could see him shaking, fumbling with the woodpile like he might vanish if he just kept moving. And in that moment, I realized that I could stop. I could step aside, claim hesitation, argue for mercy. But Harper's eyes were fixed on me. And I felt the pull of years of training, of obedience drilled in, of survival dictated by compliance. The watch pressed harder in my pocket. It had been a comfort, a reminder of my father, of home. Now it felt like a weight dragging me down, measuring the seconds before I made the choice I would never forget. Mike shifted beside me, muttering something under his breath I couldn't catch. I sensed his fear, his question, his hope that I'd act differently. I didn't. Not then. Not yet. We closed in, Harper giving the nod that ended the hesitation. I followed, boots crunching in the mud, heart hammering, and I saw the look in the boy's eyes, something I can still see, clear as the snow. He trusted no one, yet he somehow looked at me like maybe I could make it right. And I didn't. The first order we gave, the first command we shouted, it felt small at first, harmless, necessary. But I knew, deep down, that I had crossed a line I had never returned from. The ridge held its silence, the wind cutting through the trees, and the watch throbbed against my chest, a reminder that time was both my enemy and my witness. I never spoke of that moment. Not to Harper, not to Mike, not to anyone. I carried it in the spaces between breath and heartbeat, and I carried it home when the war ended. I carried it under my pillow, in the dented metal, like a confession I could never voice. Even now, decades later, I ask myself, would you have done differently? Would you have seen the weight before it fell? Or would you, like me, have taken the easy path and carried the memory like a stone for the rest of your life? That evening, the ridge fell into a brittle quiet, broken only by the wind scraping through the skeletal trees. The boy was gone. Harsh orders and hurried movements had scattered him, though I couldn't be certain. Mike and I sat a few yards apart from Harper, who was poring over a map, chalk smudging his fingers. The mud was cold, seeping through our socks, but I didn't care. My mind was elsewhere, tracing every step of the day, every decision that had led to that moment. Mike nudged me with his elbow. "You're quiet," he said softly, his breath steaming in the frozen air. I didn't answer. What could I say? That I had watched a scared kid and done what I was told. And now the face of that moment haunted me like it was tattooed behind my eyes. I only turned the watch over in my palm, feeling the dents and scratches like a pulse. It had become a talisman, or a curse. I wasn't sure which. Harper barked a command about our next move, but I barely heard it. All I could think about was the boy crouched in the firewood, and the small, invisible choice I had made to follow orders instead of listening to reason. That small act of obedience had never felt so heavy. I remembered thinking back at the farmhouse that I was just a kid following orders. That excuse felt hollow now, like paper torn and left to soak in the mud. Night fell, and the unit set up a makeshift camp along the ridge. I lay on the cold ground, blanket thin over my back, staring at the sky where the first stars had begun to pierce the dark. Mike rolled over beside me, pulling his cap low over his eyes. I could hear him breathing, regular and calm, but I knew it was an act. He was as uneasy as I was. I wondered what Harper thought. Did he even consider the weight of what we were doing? Or was it all strategy and duty, clean lines on a map, while the rest of us bore the consequences in silence? I thought about the watch, tucked beneath my coat like a secret witness, and I realized it had become more than just a keepsake. It was proof, in cold metal and ticking seconds, that I had been there, that I had made a choice. Sleep came in fits. In my dreams, the farmhouse rose from the snow, and the boy's eyes found mine every time I tried to look away. I woke once, sweating, hearing the crunch of boots in the mud outside our tent. My hand went immediately to the watch. Mike stirred and whispered something I couldn't catch. The wind answered him with a hiss, and the ridge seemed to hold its breath. By dawn, I knew we couldn't stay. Harper was already moving, map in hand, leading us back toward the main line. I pulled on my boots, mud sticking to the soles, and slipped the watch under my sleeve. I felt the weight of it as I followed Mike, who walked a few steps ahead, shoulders tense. There was a quiet, unspoken acknowledgement between us. What happened yesterday was not done with us. It would follow, lingering, waiting for us to face it. And I knew in a way I hadn't before that the ridge, the farmhouse, the boy, they weren't just memories. They were questions. Questions I didn't yet have the courage to answer. And each step back toward the main line was heavier than the last, because I knew the choice I had made was only the beginning. The line back to the unit was slower than I remembered. Mud clung to our boots, and the wind gnawed at our fingers and ears. Harper kept up a steady pace ahead, map pressed to his chest, eyes scanning the horizon as though he could will the war into neat lines. Mike and I followed, silence hanging between us like a shadow we couldn't shake. I kept the watch under my coat, turning it over in my hand when I thought no one was looking. It was the only thing that reminded me I still existed outside orders and obedience. By mid-morning, the sun cut through the gray, pale and weak, but enough to burn the mist off the fields. We passed a shell of a barn, walls splintered, roof half collapsed. The air smelled of wet hay and smoke. I thought of the boy again, crouched among firewood that morning. That image wouldn't leave me. I hadn't known it then, but some decisions have gravity that extends far beyond the moment. Some choices, small and quiet, spiral into consequences you can't see until years later. Harper signaled us to halt and crouched behind the remnants of a wall, peering through binocular. "There's movement," he whispered, nodding toward a distant cluster of buildings. "Could be a supply party. Could be. Stay ready." I felt the weight of my rifle, cold and familiar. But my mind kept straying back to that farmstead. The thought came unbidden. What if he was there? That boy? Or someone like him? What had my silence caused? Mike shifted beside me, elbow brushing mine. He didn't speak, but I felt the question in the press of his shoulder. Could we live with what we'd done? I turned the watch in my palm again. Its metal was cold, unyielding, like the truth I hadn't yet faced. It had started as a comfort, a tether to home. Now, it was a measuring stick for my failures. Harper made the call to advance, and we moved toward the buildings, boots sinking into mud and debris. I kept my head down, eyes darting to shadows, listening for any sign of life. A faint sound, a child crying maybe, or just the wind, stopped me cold. Mike caught my eye. We exchanged a glance, unspoken understanding passing between us. We both knew we were walking on the edge of something that didn't have a map. We reached the buildings, and Harper gestured sharply. "Search! Quick! No mistakes." The words were simple, but they carried an unbearable weight. I thought of the boy, crouched in fear, trusting nothing and no one. And I realized again that I had already crossed that line once. Now, the line stretched before me like a wire, and every step risked another fracture of conscience. I paused for a heartbeat, thumb brushing the watch under my coat. Could I stop? Could I act differently this time? Mike's gaze found mine, sharp and tense. Harper's eyes were on us, patient but unyielding. Time pressed down like the mud on our boots, the wind on our backs, and I felt the pull of choice again, immediate and unavoidable. I stepped forward. The ridge, the farmhouse, the boy. Everything I'd tried to bury came with me. And I knew, even as I moved, that the repercussions weren't just waiting. They were alive, winding through the day and creeping into every moment I thought I could escape. The buildings were quiet, too quiet. Mud clung to our boots as we moved between shattered walls and broken doors. Rifles ready, hearts thudding in the cold. The faint smell of smoke lingered, mingled with something sweeter, almost like bread, remnants of life that had been here or had tried to survive. My hand rested on the watch under my coat. Its cold weight reminded me I was still me, still capable of choice, even if every step forward made that harder to believe. Mike and I split from Harper, covering the perimeter, and I caught movement in the corner of my eye. A shadow, quick and tentative, ducking behind a wall. I froze. My pulse kicked. Harper was shouting instructions to us, his voice calm but sharp. "Check the rear. Move fast." But I couldn't look away from the shadow. My stomach turned over with a sense I hadn't felt since the farmhouse. That faint, impossible hope that the boy, or someone like him, had survived. Mike noticed my hesitation. He whispered, low enough for Harper not to hear. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" I nodded barely. We were at a crossroads again. Every instinct screamed to obey, to stay in line, to act as if the order was the only law that mattered. But part of me, the part that had shied away before, that had felt the weight of choice, was screaming differently. We moved closer to the wall where the shadow had vanished. My boots sank into mud, water seeping into the seam. Harper was scanning through the windows, pointing, gesturing. I could feel the pressure, that invisible force that made right and wrong bend toward obedience. But the watch was heavy in my hand, and every tick felt like it was counting the seconds until I had to make the decision. There was a sound, faint but unmistakable, a child's whimper. The hairs on my neck stood up. Mike froze beside me. Harper didn't hear it. Neither did anyone else. It was just us. A single moment, suspended in the gray light, and the weight of the choice pressed down like mud on my chest. I remember thinking then that survival had never felt so cruel. I could follow the order and be safe. I could hesitate and risk Harper's wrath, and risk the entire unit's progress. I could, maybe, save someone who had no part in the war we were fighting. My thumb brushed the watch under my coat. Its metal was cold, unyielding. Time was running, and I could not turn it back. Mike's whisper cut through my paralysis. "We can't let him die. Not again." The word, again, sank into me like ice. He was right, and he was also daring me to act. And in that instant, I realized that the first choice, the one I made at the farmhouse, was not behind me. It was here, alive, waiting for the second. I didn't speak. I only moved. Toward the shadow, toward the boy, toward a truth I could no longer ignore, though I had no idea if it would save anything, or if it would destroy what little I had left of myself. I reached the corner where the shadow had disappeared, boots sinking in the thawing mud. The whimper came again, soft and pitiful, and my stomach knotted. The boy crouched there, eyes wide and wild, shivering beneath a tattered coat. He looked at me like I was either salvation or doom. I wasn't sure which. Mike moved beside me, careful not to startle him, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder. "It's okay," he whispered. But it didn't feel okay. Not then. Not ever. Harper's voice cut through the tension. "Report!" he barked from the main building. My heart raced. If we moved too slowly, if we lingered, the punishment for disobedience was immediate. Harsh. I glanced at Mike. He nodded. The same question in his eyes that I felt pressing against my chest. Do we obey, or do we choose? I made the choice I had been avoiding for weeks. I knelt in the mud, hand outstretched. The boy flinched, but didn't run. His eyes, trusting, terrified, met mine, and for a moment the war faded. Only the tick of the watch in my palm, heavy and insistent, reminded me of time, of consequences, of all the decisions that had led me here. We moved him silently toward the edge of the building, keeping him low. Mike whispered directions, soft and urgent. And I followed, listening for Harper's commands, for the sound of the unit advancing. Every step was a balance of instinct and fear. We were defying an order, and yet, for the first time in weeks, I felt some small measure of rightness. And then, just as relief began to edge in, Harper appeared at the doorway. His eyes scanned the ridge, landed on us, and I swear I could see the storm forming behind them. "What the hell are you doing?" he barked, voice cutting through the cold air. My mouth went dry. I had no explanation, only the boy's shaking form in my arms and the mud sucking at my boots. Mike stepped closer, protective, tensed. "He's just a kid, sir," he said, voice steady but low. "He doesn't belong in this." Harper's gaze hardened. "Orders are orders. You think the war stops for feelings?" The words hit me like a blow. I felt the weight of years of obedience pressing down again. I could retreat into compliance, let Harper take him, and survive without further trouble. Or I could act. I looked at the watch, cold in my hand, its ticking louder than the wind or Harper's voice, and I knew there was no going back. Whatever came next, the choice was mine. The ridge, the farmhouse, the boy. They had all caught up with me. The first mistake, the hesitation I'd carried, had led me here. Now, the consequences of inaction or action would define the rest of my life. I took a breath. I stepped forward. We made it back to the line by nightfall. The boy huddled between Mike and me, silent and trembling. Harper didn't speak much on the way. He didn't need to. His glare was enough to keep us aware of the consequences we'd invited. I kept my hand on the watch, pressing the cold metal into my palm as if it could remind me who I was, who I had been, and what I had done. The unit murmured around us, oblivious, or perhaps willfully blind. I realized then that no one could understand the choice I had made. The weight of it? Not really. I carried it alone, a secret heavier than mud or blood. Mike glanced at me once, a small, weary nod. He knew. Wow. We didn't need words. The boy slept finally, exhausted and trusting enough to let himself fall into the haze of safety we offered. I envied that. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay on the edge of the cot, fingers brushing the watch beneath my coat. It had been my anchor, my father's gift, and now it was proof of survival, proof of my conscience's betrayal and defiance in equal measure. I thought of the farmhouse, of the first decision that had haunted me, and I realized that war wasn't about strategy or courage. It was about choices, often invisible to anyone else, and their costs. Weeks later, the boy disappeared. They claimed he'd been moved behind lines, but I never saw him again. I wondered if my choice had saved him, or if it had merely postponed tragedy. I never spoke of it, not to anyone outside Mike, who eventually drifted away after the war. Harper never asked, never acknowledged, and perhaps that was the point. Some orders are forgotten, some acts of mercy erased by duty. Decades later, I still carry the watch. Its dented metal presses against my palm like memory itself. I think of that ridge, that farmhouse, and the boy who trusted me. I think of Mike, who still visits me in dreams, urging me to see the right path I had stumbled onto. And I ask myself quietly, as I write this in a house far from snow and mud, would you have done differently? Could you have stepped off the line, defied orders, and still survived? Or is innocence a matter of perspective, a fragile thing weighed against obedience and fear? I am not proud of what I did. I am not innocent, but I am alive, and that is a truth I can neither unmake nor ignore. And maybe, somewhere in that choice, in the small act of defiance amidst the orders and chaos, there was a measure of right. Maybe that is enough, though it feels like too little after all these years. I leave this unsigned because I cannot bear to attach my name to it, but I hope that, reading it, someone, anyone, might understand the weight of small decisions, the cost of obedience, and the quiet persistence of conscience long after the guns have fallen silent.